to the release of this remarkable database and the paper that goes along with it on Chinese assistance to Africa. I want to say a couple of words about why the Center for Global Development would care about this. There's a large part of the American foreign assistance community, including probably some people here today, who are interested in Chinese foreign assistance mostly from the direction of understanding whether or not it's a threat. And there are two ways to understand whether or not it's a threat. One is it a threat to the interest of the United States and other traditional donors? But I think the more appropriate way to understand it, and the view through which the Center for Global Development would look at it, is it good for or problematic for the people of Africa? And this kind of high-resolution project-based data that we're going to be hearing about today is the sort of tool that we need in order to understand that. So my colleagues and I at the Center particularly delighted to be collaborating with AidData in the release of this information, and my colleague Vijaya Ramachandran, to have been working with Bradley Parks and others at AidData on the analysis, the preliminary analysis, I should say, of this new data treasure trove. Before I introduce Bradley, I would say one thing from a personal point of view. I'm particularly interested in this because I spent the first part of my career in East Asia, primarily in China, as a reporter. And so a media-based methodology for understanding Chinese aid to Africa appeals to me. Also, having been involved in producing some of those media reports, I have some questions about whether or not they necessarily correspond to reality on the ground, and that's part of what we're going to be learning about today. In preparing for today's event, I had an opportunity to watch the very video put together on the William and Mary website, and was interested to be reminded that much of the work, and I think some of the impetus for this, came from undergraduates. And I think that that's very exciting and something that we at CGD are proud to be part of, since the older members of my center also ride on the shoulders of young colleagues, and to know how wonderful it is to have energetic and creative and gifted young colleagues doing remarkable work. Without further ado then, it's my pleasure to introduce Bradley Parks. He's the co-executive director of AidData and William and Mary, to tell us about the data set, what they've learned, and what might still be learned. Bradley.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. It's an honor to be here today. First, I just want to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts of my colleagues at AidData and CGD. Austin Strange, Andreas Fuchs, Axel Dreher, Mike Tierney, Vij, several AidData staff members, some of whom cannot be here today, including Brian O'Donnell and Robert Masolgo, and a team of 15 student research assistants have poured thousands of hours of sweat equity into this project. Without their determination, we would not be here today, I can assure you, announcing the publication of a 12-year database of Chinese development finance activities to Africa. For those of you who may not know much about AidData's work, I'd like to take a moment to first just explain what we do and how it led us to this project. So AidData has a simple mission, making aid information more accessible and more usable. And we do this in several ways. We collect, curate, and publish data on more than $5.5 trillion in development finance from 90 bilateral and multilateral agencies, and we do this at the project level. We support a global network of analysts who use our data to conduct cutting-edge research on aid allocation and impact. We geo-reference aid activities and help researchers and policymakers visualize and analyze the spatial distribution of aid vis-a-vis measures of need and opportunity. We also create decision support tools that make it possible for aid agencies and development banks to more effectively target, coordinate, and evaluate their overseas activities. And last but not least, we create technologies to crowdsource information about the status and the performance of aid projects. One of the biggest challenges that we face at AidData is the need to keep up with a rapidly changing global development finance architecture. In many Western countries, aid budgets are leveling off or declining. By contrast, many non-Western countries are rapidly expanding their overseas development activities. These tectonic shifts in the global architecture of development finance pose a challenge to the viability of reporting systems that Western governments put in place after World War II to track who is doing what and where they're doing it. Today, the member states of the OECD largely comply with a common set of data disclosure norms that they established to monitor and coordinate their own activities. However, the emerging powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are not part of the DAC, and they don't seem to be particularly eager to follow a set of rules put in place by OECD member states. The existing global reporting regime for development finance is facing a crisis of relevance, rather. Cracks are emerging in the foundation of a voluntary disclosure system that was developed more than 5 decades ago. As the share of global development finance provided by these non-DAC donors increases, it's becoming more and more difficult to get a handle on where resources are flowing and for what purpose. This is a major challenge for scholars, policymakers, development practitioners, advocacy groups, and journalists who want to understand the distribution and impact of development finance. So, to respond to this challenge, AidData has developed different tools and techniques over the years to track the activities of non-DAC donors. We work directly with non-DAC agency staff to collect, standardize, collate, and publish their data. We also use web scraping, API, and optical character recognition technologies to enable automated data capture. And we've used these tools and techniques to access and publish data from countries like Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. However, China is one of the largest, if not the largest, non-DAC supplier of development finance, and to date, our efforts have not been successful to persuade China of the value of open data. When we last approached China's Ministry of Commerce, the lead agency responsible for foreign aid policy, and made a case for why the government should consider unlocking access to data on their overseas aid activities, their response to us was that, quote, "Everyone who needs to know about our generosity already knows." In December 2011, China sent the very same signal to the international community. At a global summit on aid effectiveness in Busan, South Korea, the Chinese government signaled that it was effectively opting out of global reporting systems such as the International Aid Transparency Initiative and the OECD's creditor reporting system. Given that China has not disclosed country-level or project-level data on its overseas development finance activities, folks have had to come up with some pretty clever ways to estimate how much funding the Chinese are providing and to whom. One of these workarounds is data collection from media reports. But efforts to collect development finance data using media reports have run into 5 major challenges. First, these studies have relied heavily on individual sources rather than triangulating information from many sources. Second, insufficient attention has been paid to duplicate projects, leading to inflated estimates of Chinese aid. Third, heavy reliance on English language news sources has resulted in missing many projects reported by Chinese language sources. Fourth, previous efforts failed to follow projects from announcement to implementation, which led to a lot of overcounting since a significant number of projects get mothballed or canceled after being announced. Finally, methods and sources were mostly not disclosed, making it difficult to subject the findings to external scrutiny. So about 18 months ago, a student named Austin Strange, who cannot be here today, walked into my office at the College of William & Mary with a very big idea. He proposed creating a different type of media-based data collection methodology, a methodology that would be systematic, transparent, and replicable. Systematic in the sense that the methods would be applied in a consistent and rigorous manner, transparent in the sense that all of the methods and sources would be publicly disclosed and subject to external scrutiny, and replicable in the sense that we would provide a detailed step-by-step guide describing how the data were assembled so that anyone who wanted to recreate the data or challenge the data could do so. We both agreed there was no guarantee this would work, but it was worth a try. So Austin helped assemble a team of 24 staff, faculty, and students from William & Mary, Princeton, Heidelberg University, and CGD. And this team spent roughly a year and a half creating, testing, and fine-tuning the methodology. So we'll probably discuss the details of the methodology at greater length during the Q&A. But in the interest of time, I want to just highlight a few of its key features. The The 60-page codebook, which you can now access at china.aiddata.org, outlines a detailed guide to collecting the data, which involves, first, synthesizing and standardizing project-specific information from thousands of English language and Chinese language media reports contained in Factiva, a Dow Jones search engine that draws on 31,000 sources from 200 countries. Then, assigning projects unique identification numbers as they are discovered and entered into the database, and then systematically assigning values to 57 variables for every one of those projects in the database, including things such as the status of the project, the sector, the financial amount, the terms of the financial agreement, and so forth. The methodology also involves cross-checking and updating the values assigned to these variables based on triangulation of information from media sources not identified through Factiva, as well as identifying and eliminating duplicate projects and tracking the progression of projects so that it's possible to distinguish between pledges, official commitments, projects in implementation, completed projects, suspended projects, and canceled projects. So media data are not perfect. Some projects may never get picked up by the media if they're small or they're not very visible. Also, if neither party to a transaction wants to disclose a deal, media-based data do not provide a solution. Also, to Lawrence's point, journalists can get things wrong. The Chinese government uses some financial modalities that are complex and not particularly well understood. So it's possible that media-based methods can yield partial or inaccurate data on the financial terms of an agreement. At the same time, media-based data collection offers some big advantages, and we didn't fully appreciate these advantages when we embarked upon this initiative. Much to our surprise, we learned that media-based data collection can help uncover projects that never enter official reporting systems. Take the case of Malawi. Malawi's Ministry of Finance maintains a database of all incoming aid flows. This database lists only 2 Chinese-funded projects worth $133 million from 2000 to 2011. So AidData used its media-based methodology, and we uncovered those 2 very same projects, but we also uncovered an additional 14 development finance projects funded by the People's Republic of China during the exact same period of time. These 14 projects, which are displayed in the red dots here on the map, collectively constitute an additional $164 million that was not being captured in official reporting systems. So this finding sort of suggests that official data are not always or necessarily superior. Another key feature of this project is the care with which the team addressed the issue of what counts as aid. We're often asked, how much aid is China giving to Africa? Or does China give more aid to Africa than the US? And the answer to both of these questions is, it depends on what you think should be considered aid. China provides development finance through a diverse set of financing modalities that defy traditional OECD categories. Beijing uses a mix of concessional and non-concessional loans, suppliers and buyers export credits, which count as so-called other official flows but not ODA, lines of credit, and also official and quasi-official forms of investment. So our fear is that analysts will continue to talk past each other and compare apples and oranges until they can agree on a categorization scheme for classifying different types of official Chinese finance. And once we agree on this categorization scheme, to enable comparisons with what the DAC donors, the Western donors, are doing. So as you see on the screen here, we attempted to build such a categorization scheme, and we used this scheme consistently to classify every project in our database. One way of categorizing Chinese development finance, or rather, our way of categorizing Chinese development finance is probably imperfect, and we will likely update it and improve it over time. But at the very least, we hope that the publication of this categorization scheme will encourage users of the data to be more careful about how they define and measure Chinese aid. So I know that many of you are probably eager to know what the data shows, so without further ado, I'd like to highlight just 4 of our key findings. First, we found that the definition of aid you use has a big impact on how you assess the magnitude of Chinese aid. If we use a definition of aid that closely aligns with the OECD's Official Development Assistance definition, our database, according to that definition, identifies roughly $1.1 billion a year of official commitments from China to Africa. This is significantly less than the US gives to Africa each year. However, if you include ODA and other official finance activities that do not meet or that do not have a grant element of at least 25%, which is the benchmark that the OECD sets for ODA, then China is roughly providing the same amount of development finance to Africa as the United States. These side-by-side graphs on the screen throw into sharp relief the differences in the composition of Chinese and US official finance to Africa. China provides more what the OECD calls other official flows, or OOF. This is funding from a government that does not necessarily or is below the 25% grant element threshold. So China provides more of that funding than they do ODA. And the reverse is true of the US, as this graph shows. The US provides far more ODA than OOF. The green shaded stack in China's graph also shows that there is a huge percentage of Chinese official finance that we simply do not have enough information about to classify as either ODA or OOF. Okay, second finding. The database demonstrates that there is wide variation in the cross-country distribution of Chinese official finance. By our calculations, in absolute terms, the largest recipients of Chinese official finance during our period of study, 2000 to 2011, were Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Angola, and Mauritania. If you look at the significance of incoming Chinese official finance relative to the size of individual African economies, Mauritania, Ghana, Zimbabwe, and Equatorial Guinea represent the countries that depend most heavily on Chinese support. In Mauritania, official Chinese finance constitutes a whopping 12% of its GNI. Okay, third finding is the sectoral distribution of Chinese official finance. So health, education, and government and civil society activities constitute more than 40% of the Chinese ODA that we tracked, at least in terms of the number of projects. Now, in monetary terms, debt relief and transport projects make up over 50% of Chinese ODA flows. But when you examine Chinese official finance writ large, when you include OOF, you find that health, education, and government and civil society activities, they still predominate when you measure this according to project numbers. But in monetary terms, this is where you really start to see the transportation and energy projects that we often associate with Chinese development finance figuring more prominently. The transportation and energy sector projects constitute over 40% of Chinese official finance. Fourth, our data suggests that it is extremely important to track whether announced projects actually get implemented. In an average year, only about half of the committed projects in our data set are reported as implemented or completed. In monetary terms, the total value of all reported official finance projects, excluding canceled and suspended projects, is $101 billion over the 12-year study period. However, when pledged projects that do not reach the commitment, implementation, or completion stage are eliminated, when they're taken out, this figure drops to $75 billion. Then if you exclude pledges and commitments, the estimate falls even further to $49 billion. And if you exclude all projects except those that have been completed, the number drops over that 12-year period to $19 billion. So without systematically tracking the status of projects, it would be very easy and tempting to inflate estimates of Chinese official finance to Africa. Finally, I'd just like to say a word about next steps. So we harbor no illusions that these data are perfect or that they are fully comprehensive. However, we take the view that the stakes are simply too high to accept ignorance rather than an evidence base with some level of imprecision. Will others find mistakes in these data? Absolutely. Are we concerned about that? Absolutely not. We've been collecting development finance data for 10 years, and we find errors in the official data all the time. You can't fix errors until you know they exist, and more sunlight and scrutiny in our judgment is the best way to spot and fix errors. To this end, we've built an online database platform at china.aiddata.org with the express purpose of throwing these data under a very bright spotlight. We want help exposing and correcting errors and filling in missing data points. We want to crowdsource higher resolution and higher quality Chinese development finance data. We know that there are researchers, journalists, government officials, contractors, and others who are knowledgeable about individual Chinese projects. We want to enlist their support. We want to leverage the information and the insights that they can bring to bear to improve this database. The online platform will not only allow users to enhance our data by providing comments, photos, videos, field reports, and project documents, but it will also enable users to challenge the data or challenge specific data points and suggest new projects not previously identified. We will, of course, have a team in place to vet this information from the crowd. So ultimately, our aim is to democratize access to information about Chinese development finance projects. We believe with better information, the Chinese authorities, local stakeholders in Africa, and the broader global development community will better understand China's influence and impact on the continent. Thank you.
I'd like to, first, thanks, Bradley, for a really terrific presentation. I don't know about you, but certainly whetted my appetite to learn more about this and dig into the data. I want to invite the other panel members, if you would, to please come up and take your seats. And I think I'll introduce them as they speak. Our first commentator will be my colleague Vijaya Ramachandran. She's an expert in the private sector development in Africa and a co-author of the paper. And Vijay, I'd been hearing from you for months about how exciting this was, and I had an opportunity to see Bradley and his colleagues present it internally, but it wasn't really, Bradley, until I saw you present the full force of it that I understood just really what you've achieved. It's really very, very impressive. So, Vij, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Lawrence. I'll be very brief because I think Jan has several points she would like to make as well. First of all, I want to thank the AidData team for this collaboration. I think it was really very, very useful for us at the center to look at your approach and at these data. You know, we're very interested in non-traditional donors and the emerging donors, and it has been extremely difficult to get information about these donors. So I think from that perspective, this is an enormous contribution to an evolving field. There's no doubt that there's very little data available about China. It's very difficult to decipher official Chinese data. It's also difficult to interpret what's out there. The paper that we've released today also contains a literature review of all the different sources of Chinese aid. You can see all the different efforts. There have been several efforts to do this, of course. And so it's useful to sort of look at all of those approaches and then compare it with, you know, what we have done here. It's, I think, extremely useful to also triangulate across all of these sources. This is an area where I think we have a lot to learn. We have a long way to go in terms of understanding what's going on. This is also true, for example, of the Arab states that are major donors. It's true of India, which is emerging as a donor to many countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa. It's true of South Korea that now has an official aid agency. All of these players are new. They are not particularly conforming to DAC standards. They're doing development assistance in a very different way than previously understood. And so I think from that perspective, this data approach has been extremely helpful. And for us to look at these data and what has emerged from these years of sweat equity and data collection, I think has been very, very valuable to us at CGD. This issue about, you know, implementation versus announcing, I think it's useful to know what's announced and not completed. There's clearly a political element to this as well as a development angle. And it would be interesting to be able to separate that out a bit. You know, so the data show that a number of projects have been announced, and then some subset of that is not yet implemented and perhaps will never be implemented. And, you know, one could interpret that as sort of spurious data. You're sort of inflating the figures too high. But I think a better interpretation of that is to actually do the comparison and see, you know, what's been announced versus what's been implemented and completed. I think that will give us kind of a unique perspective into China's political ambitions in Africa, as well as the sort of the development activities. You know, it may be that they're announcing things for strategic reasons, perhaps sometimes with not much of an intention to complete them, and that would be worth knowing. And I think one useful thing about this approach is that it kind of allows you to filter the data that way and see, you know, what's been announced, what's been implemented, and then what's been completed. Finally, I want to say, you know, the triangulation issue, I think, is a dynamic one. I mean, you can triangulate now with what's available, but there's no doubt that as we go forward, I think this is going to become become a very valuable tracking device. We can track these projects in comparison to other data sources, in comparison to other people's work. We can also just track it relative to our own data. You know, we can see kind of what has happened to these projects over time. I really do hope that this crowdsourcing element of this database, which is a very unique element, becomes something that people take seriously. I mean, certainly a new way to collect data. The DAC data never really used that approach. It was done pretty much by a team at DAC. But this is a very different approach, and I think it sort of reflects the technological age we live in. You know, we have access to all of these different social media platforms, and also access to interactive data sites that we didn't have when we collected data on Europe and the US and so on. So I'm hoping that you all will take that part seriously, the crowdsourcing part, and that as this data go public, and it's in several media today, it'll be in more newspapers, I think, in the coming weeks. I really hope that people do take that part of it seriously and start to challenge some of the data and add information to the database, and track it over time as we try to understand this very complex question of China's activities in Africa. So I'll stop there, Lawrence.
Vij, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce our discussant. Before I do, there are a few people in the back, and there are a few seats up front, including the seats vacated by our panel. If anybody would like to sit, you should feel free to come up now or at any point during the discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce Yan Wang. She is a senior fellow at Peking University and a visiting professor at George Washington's University School of Business, and until recently was in the World Bank, and has previously also worked as a research coordinator for the OECD DAC China Study Group. I see I keep wanting to say Wang Yan, which is probably the Chinese word order, yes. So excuse me for tripping on your name. That you are also have received the Yefang Award in Economics, the highest award in economics in China. I think this is particularly interesting, and I'm really looking forward to your remarks, because there are very few people who are able to span the two worlds of Western scholarship and the Western multilaterals and sort of open and inquiring approach, and also to understand the viewpoint from within China. And I'm reminded, there's been a fair amount of media coverage today already, and Quartz, which runs a lively online presence, their headline, Vij, I don't know if you saw it or Bradley, was $75 billion in previously secret aid revealed. Well, yeah, kind of. It certainly was not announced and transparent, but that's also not necessarily identical to something that's been hidden, because the approach to transparency differs a lot. So I don't know if you're going to get into that, but I'm looking forward very much to your remarks.
Thank you, Lawrence, for inviting me. It's my great pleasure to be here at CGD. I have read the paper very carefully, and I think the paper is rich and provide very useful information and value added to the literature, and promoted transparency in AidData. But we do find some discrepancies with the official data. But I think it's possible to correct the data, so through the interaction with the website. So I really appreciate the efforts by the team and by CGD, and I commend the team for the tremendous efforts. I have 3 points, 3 major points and 2 minor points. First, you all have this handout. First point is that the paper itself needs to take into account China's income per capita level. And China is one of the southern partners, and the partnership started 60 years ago when China was poorer than the sub-Saharan African countries. And now China has an income level which is 1/4 or 1/5 of that of the Western European countries and traditional donors. So China's current income level is around $5,000 US. But China has provided quite a significant amount of official development finance over the years. So the official South-South Development Cooperation started in the 1950s, okay, 60 years ago. And southern partners differ from the northern partners significantly. In terms of its history, in terms of the development level, in terms of the development stage, the structure of the production, as well as the voice in global governance structure. Okay, so if you have a look at the page 4, I did this chart when I was at the OECD DAC and China study group. And we compare China's GDP per capita as well as all the other donors. We look at the two dimensions, GDP per capita as well as ODA as a percentage of GDI. So as you can see that China is at the left-hand side, bottom. So China's GDP level is not in the same league. So China's GDP per capita was only 3,000 at the year 2007, and now it's only 5,000 per capita. So it's not in the same league, and China has a lot of room to grow. This is only at the beginning of the process. Secondly, China's role in infrastructure is kind of underestimated and underemphasized in the paper. China accounts for over 30% of the total value of infrastructure projects being implemented in Africa, higher than other existing donors. So our colleague at the World Bank, Vivian Foster, said, donors have neglected the power sector since 1990s. So for 20 years, donors have not invested in the power sector. As you know, when we go to African countries, you all experience the blackouts. So this power sector is the bottleneck of growth. China has focused on bottleneck releasing infrastructure by meeting the unmet demand from the African countries. So when you talk with the African officials, you all know this fact. The size of the projects is large as compared to those of the Western donors. The next chart shows the composition of China's commitment in the infrastructure. You can see that China committed 50% of the commitments were electricity. And also, China contributed to build 9 gigawatts in power generation in Africa. And this was provided by the World Bank, our colleague Vivian Foster's study. So you can have a look at the table. Adding all these projects together is 9 gigawatts. For ease of comparison, the Hoover Dam in the US generates 2 gigawatts of electricity. That is saying that China has contributed to 4 times the Hoover Dam in Africa, whereas the paper underestimated this aspect of China's role. In the next slides, I show 2 major hydropower stations in Africa. One is in Sudan, one is in Ethiopia, where I have been. So I've seen Chinese engineers working shoulder to shoulder with African workers. Third point is that China has been following comparative advantages in the domestic development, in the international trade, as Justin Lin said that. Also, we have been following comparative advantages in providing South-South development cooperation. China has followed its own experience at building 6 economic zones in Africa, focusing on hardware. However, China has limited institutional capacity, especially weak in institutions, in legal institutions. So China is still learning and learning fast. So in the next stage, perhaps China will pay more attention to software, in intangibles and the quality of aid. So in the next few slides, you can see that I show that China combines trade aid and official foreign direct investment, outward foreign direct investment. Construction sector in particular is labor intensive, and China is making use of its comparative advantage. As China's labor cost rising, Chinese enterprises are going global. My colleague Xiao Fang is here, and she did a study on Chinese enterprises in Africa. And Justin Lin and I wrote a paper on BRICS are becoming leading dragons, and the outward FDI is rising fast and reaching to $70 billion per year from China. The next slides show that emerging G20 countries, including China, BRICS countries, are becoming development financiers in 2015 to 2050. So this is based on the Bank of England study, and which shows the share of global G20 savings are rising from less than 50% to 80% from emerging donors, emerging G20 countries. And the next slide shows that the source of saving and finance till 2050. So in the next decades, we can see that development financing will not come mostly from ODA, but mostly from OOF, and from OOF-like loans from developing countries, from emerging markets, and so forth. I fully agree with Mr. Yamamoto said. China has already played an important role to the African's economic development and will play an increasingly important role in the future. So we have to engage in China and engage in the dialogues and promote transparency. Okay, so I believe my time is up. So I think China's engagement in Africa is mostly win-win situation, and the development impact is large, and we challenge all of you to do some research on the development impact of these projects. And we hope that we can work together to help China in helping African countries. Thanks.
Yan Wang, thank you very much. I want to pose a question, but I don't want you to answer it now. I want you to think about it, because one of the things that I'm curious about is how authorities in China who are involved in China's foreign assistance and other involvement in Africa are going to view this, whether they will see it as a useful source themselves or whether they in fact already have something more comprehensive that they can look at. It's maybe a question of speculation. And then secondly, whether the availability of this will encourage those in China who would like to be more transparent, to be more forthcoming. So if you could be thinking about those questions. And Andreas, I don't know that it was scheduled, not in the material I had, but I saw you were taking good notes. And so if there's anything that Yan Wang said where you could respond to her questions or comments, I'd be very interested in that. And then I think we will open it to the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments. Very much appreciated. So I think your first point was already really important. So it's important to emphasize that China is not a new donor at all. And many say it's non-traditional donor, but this is just wrong. So China also has long aid traditions, going back to the 1950s, as long as many Western donors, even longer than many of them. So yeah, I think this is really important to emphasize. And I think both can learn from one another. Though I think this project to increase transparency may also help the Western donors to learn from China. So I think this is also only the beginning. I think that's right. So if you look at forecasts, we expect that the Chinese economy will grow in the years to come. And this will also further increase Chinese aid budgets and Chinese involvement in official development finance in general. And if you look at it, and now China and the US almost provide the same amount of official development finance to Africa, and then I think we can sort of extrapolate what we can expect for the next couple of years. So second point, I think I want to talk a bit about the role of infrastructure. So this is what we all expected, and this is also what we find. But what we also saw is that Chinese aid activities are so diverse. So China is active in almost all sectors. And I think here it's interesting to look at where China is not active. And there what you see is that we didn't track one single project in environmental protection. And there are just a few, I think 3 projects in women in development. So I think this is a big difference. Although we see that the size is more or less equal, we find really striking differences in the sectoral breakdown. And as a conclusion, I think that Western aid, or aid provided by the Development Assistance Committee, and Chinese aid are more complements than substitutes. And then I think investments are really important. And this was, I have to emphasize, this was meant to be a project on development aid. So in the process, we uncovered a lot of investment projects, but the focus of the projects was on development aid. So the numbers and figures we have in the paper just relate to official development finance and exclude investment activities. If you go to the web page, you will still find a lot of investments, so official investments by state agencies, state-owned enterprises, and private enterprises, but we believe it's less comprehensive. But I think it's important to emphasize that this is just one tool of Chinese activities in Africa. And we hope that this will help to make an end to apples to oranges comparisons. And in the way we try to separate these flows, but we have to acknowledge that these flows are largely intertwined.
Thanks very much. Before I open up, I pose one question maybe for either Andreas or Vidge or Bradley. And to do that, I want to relate a story. Some of you know that our colleague, Steve Radlett, was involved as an advisor to Liberia when they were in the early stages of recovering from the Civil War. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf came and spoke at a couple of CGD events, and she told 2 stories that have stuck in my mind. And I'm maybe conflating stories I heard from Steve, but I suspect that they are both probably from the same source. One is that in the very early days after the Civil War, when the government was just trying to get in place, there wasn't even furniture. I mean, the buildings were bombed out. Not only was there no electricity, there was no paper, there were no desks, there were no stools. And the donors, the traditional donors in the U.S. came in and sort of said, well, you know, what do you need? What do you need? And the Chinese showed up and looked around, and next day, the office furniture arrived. You know, they understood what was needed immediately, and they delivered it. And a larger story that I heard had to do with roads, that Liberia was very keen to have the road network reconstructed, and that the World Bank and other donors were not so keen on roads for a variety of reasons, and that the Chinese then moved ahead with roads. And this relates to what you said, Wang Yan, about finding the bottlenecks and addressing those bottlenecks. And so I guess my question is really related to that. idea of bottlenecks, I was so struck, Andres, when you said not a single project on environment. Well, that's really maybe not so surprising given the state of the Chinese environment. And perhaps there's not really a vacuum when it comes to gender. Maybe the gender stuff is being done. So at the end you said there's a complementarity. Do you see this focus on infrastructure and on relief of bottlenecks that sort of the conventional wisdom would suggest? And is there anything in the data that would shed light on this wonderful story about the Chinese just bringing in the office furniture the next day?
Yes, so one thing we can't do with the database, so we have no information, or we don't have much information about the speed. So I share this observation, and I think it would be interesting to do, but I think this is really difficult with media reports. What we can say, though, we have seen the graph that showed the amount, the share of projects implemented, completed, pledged, and committed. So here, at least, we have the feeling that there are still a lot of things going on, but I think it's difficult to draw conclusions on speed. The second point, infrastructure, definitely. So this is in terms of aid amount, this is after debt relief, the second largest sector, if you look at the dollar values. But I would emphasize again that this is not all China is doing in Africa. So much of the debate just focuses around this issue of natural resources and infrastructure building, where there's so diverse activities in the health sector, in the education sector, and also surprisingly, one of the most important sectors is what the DAC codes, the OECD codes as government and civil society. So it's mainly about the government part, less about civil society, but still, I think this was one of the surprising things that came out of our project.
Thanks very much. Could my colleague who's got the microphone let me know who you are? Great. So I think we'll open it up now. I have not forgotten my question to you, Yanwang. We're going to come back to that question, but I think there's a lot of knowledge in this audience. What I'd like to do is collect maybe 3 or 4 questions. We'll take the lady here in front, in the black jacket with the blue sleeves, and then Bill Savadoff, senior fellow here at CGD, and the gentleman next to him. We'll take those 3 questions. Maybe I'll add one more. Please identify yourself and keep your question brief if you can.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguro. I'm a businesswoman based here in Washington, D.C., and a non-profit. Thank you so much, Global for Development, for this wonderful event. And I want to thank the United States for supporting Africa for so many years. And China, now that China is in Africa now, I'm from Kenya. And China, as you've explained, Yang Wang, China has entered into Africa so basic things. Education, healthcare, women issues, children issues. So there's so common things, infrastructure that could help a common person. And they got in, and that's what people wanted to see. But America, of course, they helped Africa, but they took much research on things that were not so much important to the common people, though we all thank you. So what you said as China is in Africa, we are looking to work with China, and as a business person, all people have gone to China now, especially women. You know, women can buy everything, women can do everything. So I thank China for doing business in Africa. I don't see anything wrong, because we are women and children who need everything. So we are ready to work with China and do business in China as Africans and as Americans. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bill Savadoff, please.
I'm Bill Savadoff. I'm a senior fellow at CGD. I was fascinated you put up Malawi, because everybody gets, has a sense of China being involved because of anecdotes. And I was in Lilongwe about 4 years ago, and just going around with a junior technical staff person from the Ministry of Finance, we'd go by a building and say, oh, the Chinese built that. Oh, the Chinese built that. And 3 of the things that they mentioned were on your list, but had not been in the official thing. So I thought that's another source you need to look at, junior staff and finance ministries. I had 2 very first crowdsourcing. I had 2 small comments and a question. I guess the first thing is about this difference between announced, committed, completed. When I worked at the IDB, I was always fascinated. There was a lot more media reports about when a loan was approved than when a project was completed. And that always surprised me, because I always thought the political bang in these things was the ribbon cutting, you know, when the school is built and stuff like that. It was actually around when the loans were made or when the grant was approved. And so I'm not sure, not knowing how your methods are, whether there might be an overrepresentation of that part of it, and a lot harder to verify when things are implemented and completed. The second thought, obviously this is future research, was if you took your method and applied it to a small OECD country and compared it to what the official data, you've thought about this, okay, to sort of get a sense of how much the method would work. And then the final thing is the substantive point. It's clear that China is doing a lot of work in infrastructure, but there's a very clear reason why the World Bank, other development banks, I mean, the World Bank and the donors have moved out of energy in Africa. I mean, there are years of work in Nigeria with 0 or negative rates of return on projects. And so, to me, the bigger question isn't whether China is investing in infrastructure, but whether whether China is doing a better job with those countries of creating projects that actually generate benefits. And as far as I know, at this point, I don't have any information on that. That's what I'd be curious about. Thanks.
And this, yes, sir. This will be the final question in this round.
David Shen, George Washington University. I'm intrigued by the component that is called other official finance, which looms very, very large in your calculations in terms of China. And I'm a little unclear, it's a little unclear to me what you're putting into that category. And what I would like to do is propose an example of Chinese assistance to Africa, and maybe you could tell me how you would include it in your data. The case in point would be $13.5 billion in Chinese loans to Angola over the last 10 years that are at LIBOR plus anywhere from 1.5% to 2% interest rate, which means they're nice concessionary loans. But how do you calculate that in terms of your data? Do you take the concessionary component and make that ODA? What do you do with the $13.5 billion in loan, which has to be repaid? As it happens, it's repaid in oil going to China, and Angola then uses almost all of that $13.5 billion for infrastructure projects in Angola by Chinese companies. So in fact, most of the money never leaves China.
Thanks very much. David Shin, you're modest, not to say you're a former U.S. ambassador to Africa, and hence you're very familiar, I think, with some of to a number of countries, to Angola in particular. Why don't we take Ambassador Shin's question first, if you would, because the specifics of that example might be might be harder to keep in your heads, and then we'll come to Bill's question. And I think that the initial comment, while very kind, was not actually a question, so we'll take those two questions and then I'll do another round.
Sure, I'll start us off and let my colleagues supplement. So Ambassador Shin, to your point, the other official flows category is not a category that we created. It's a category that the OECD created nearly 4 or 5 decades ago. And essentially, it includes loans that have a grant element of less than 25%. It includes export credits, both for suppliers and for buyers. It also includes grants that are given without development intent. So if there's a grant given with commercial intent or representational intent, that, according to the OECD rules, is not supposed to be counted as ODA. So there are other things that fall in that category, but that's broadly speaking what's captured. I think if I understood the point you were making there at the end, I think we're in total agreement. I mean, one of the sort of arcane measurement issues that is so consequential when we have these big debates about how much aid US is giving or China is giving is just the way that the rules were set up when the DAC first created this system of measuring ODA. And one of the secrets is that when the DAC calculates ODA, if a loan has a concessionary element of, let's say, 25%, they don't count the grant element alone as the ODA contribution. They count the full value of the loan, right? So if it's a $13 billion loan, they count the full value of the loan as ODA. And I think there's a robust discussion happening right now about whether that's the appropriate way to move forward.
Bill's questions had to do with whether commitments, I guess it's anecdotal evidence that commitments might also be underreported. I guess I had worried, or rather that completion is underreported. I had worried about the opposite problem, that commitments tend to get overreported, but either way you might get a similar result. Something I had wondered about, applying the methodology to a country where you actually have official data, doing the comparison. And then the final question, I think, had to do with whether the Chinese are going to get higher rates of return on their infrastructure work than others. Vijay, I see you nodding. Maybe you want to take the last bit? I know you work on those issues.
I'll take the last bit. I think there's a few studies out there now that are attempting to assess the quality of these projects. My sense is that some of the road projects have shown that the roads are of quite good quality, contrary to sort of this kind of initial feeling that these projects were being done extremely quickly and were therefore, flimsy construction. I think that has turned out to be not quite the case. There are some projects, of course, that have run into trouble, but there are also a number of road projects that have been completed very successfully and that are quite good quality roads and that have made a huge difference in terms of, trade and economic impact and so on. I think the story is more complicated when one comes to mines, for example. So, the Chinese operation of mines in Zambia has been a very mixed story. There's been real issues around the hiring and the use of labor. And in fact, the current president, I think, of Zambia ran on an anti-China platform, arguing that Zambians should have much more control over the conditions around which Chinese are allowed to operate mines. So it's a complex story, but I think some people are trying to understand both what the economic returns of these projects are and if these projects are of good quality. I think broadly speaking, on the infrastructure side, people seem to think that these are quite high quality projects. They certainly don't run into the kinds of delays that the traditional donors have. The World Bank has a 24-month approval process for infrastructure projects and for most projects, and I think China's able to do these much faster.
And for Bill's other two questions, Andreas, or?
I can take, so what is left? So the question about the status, the project status, so whether the project is completed versus whether it's just a pledge. So how do we code it? So the idea is we consider, we code a project as implemented if there's evidence that it has been started. So for example, if the construction of the school has been started, then we code it as implementation. And if there's a media report or any evidence that the school has been opened, then we consider it as a completed project. So I think, so there's just, if you look at the figure you have seen, so you see that in 2011, there are much more projects in the early stages, so pledges or commitments, but this just makes sense. So for 2011, it's less likely that the project already has been implemented or completed because it has just been announced. So I think what you see there is just what you would expect.
Can I?
Bradley, and then Yan Wang. And I also want to come back, Yan Wang, to my question, your speculations about the impact of this database in China. So first, Bradley.
I'll be very quick. To your point about applying this methodology to a DAC donor, this is one of our top priorities. I think, in terms of identifying unknown biases in the methodology, this is the way to go, right? If we can do a one-for-one comparison of this is what you get with applying MBDC, the medium-based data collection methodology, to the U.S., and then this is what you get when you just take the official data. That will help us tease out the biases, and we can't fix the biases or account for them until we know that they exist. So that's a wonderful suggestion.
Have you picked your country? Are you open to suggestions?
We may be biased towards a small country with few projects, maybe Ireland or Iceland.
Yan Wang, I think you wanted to address that question and also the question I asked about the likely response in China to this database.
Yes, I would like to address the question how to promote transparency that you raised. First of all, I think the CRS, reporting system is not perfect. So China did not participate in that design of the reporting system, and also the categories and definitions are not consulted. I mean, it's not perfect. For example, China provides a lot of in-kind assistance to many other countries. And this follow the tradition of Russians, Soviet Union's support to China in the early years. And it's difficult to calculate the total cost of in-kind support, and it's very difficult to estimate the cost of labor and expertise that China send to African countries. For example, we send medical teams to African countries for 30 years. And we send a lot of engineers and workers to African countries. It's very difficult to calculate the cost of labor in that sense. Also, China has been working shoulder to shoulder with African countries. I mean, all the engineers stayed together with workers. And they don't stay in a five-star hotels. So we can see their working conditions. So that's why the Chinese projects are cheap. I mean, very inexpensive as compared to donor countries' projects. Okay, that's why the rate of return could be higher. That's China's comparative advantage. Labor is cheap and engineers are cheaper. Thank you.
I want to push you a little bit on the database. I understand your point about valuing these things, and putting a value is extremely difficult. But is it your guess that there's a database in China that somebody has, which has not been released, in which these 7,500 projects are all listed in one place? Or is it your guess that the data has not previously been collected in a central way, and therefore the existence of the database and the kind of analysis that could be done on sector distribution, distribution across country, location, setting aside the question of value, that this will be new and of interest to the authorities who are involved? I assume it's of interest to Chinese scholars, because Chinese scholars won't have had the data at all. But my question is whether there's a centralized database in China, in your guess, that already has this information in it. And if we had only had that database, then Bradley and his friends could have saved a lot of work. Or have they actually created some new knowledge that the Chinese government itself lacks? Yes,
Well, I worked with OECD and Chinese partners during my tenure as the coordinator.
Thank you. It's John Simon with Total Impact Advisors. I just want to go back to
previously of CGD. We're happy to claim you, John. Welcome back.
Center for Global Development. I don't want to de-emphasize that. I want to go back to Ambassador Shin's question about the other official flows. I mean, my understanding is a $13 billion in loans at LIBOR plus anything would count as non-concessional because it's not 25%, and therefore would be part of that OOF number. And so that OOF number gets very big for things like that. And I wonder if there's a lot of things going on in there. For instance, when CNOOC makes an investment, which is a Chinese state-owned oil company, that counts. Would that count as OOF? Whereas when Exxon or Mobil or Chevron make an investment, it doesn't. And similarly, in your comparison, I didn't see, for instance, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation or Exim, which of course provide non-concessional but OOF type funding. And so when you're making those comparisons, I'm just wondering if those types of issues have been teased out.
John, thanks very much. And if just pass the mic to your right.
Hi there. My name is Mkunde Mwase, and I'm an economist at the IMF. So I had a question, sort of following up on his question. So with the same Angola project, how would you, given that the project would have the loan component, but at the same time would have in-kind projects mingled in, how are you then able to separate it? Because it's a very complex web. So I wanted to get a flavor more how you were actually decomposing this. And then secondly, on the other, I wondered whether you were incorporating humanitarian assistance, because China treats that completely separately from development assistance. And there would be the environmental assistance, if there was an earthquake, or all sorts of other humanitarian related assistance will be provided completely separately. So I wondered whether that is in your database. And then I had two comments, actually. I had a question on whether, because you mentioned that the projects, sorry, I can't really see the name properly. The lady at the end mentioned that the projects were completed very, very well and seem to, the completion rate of the project seems to be fairly good. But then I wondered whether there was an assessment of whether the projects themselves that were chosen were of macroeconomic importance, because we've heard there are a number of prestige projects that have been undertaken. At the same time, there are issues of maintenance of these projects. And then a final point was whether you noted the concentration of projects in certain countries, which would raise the concerns we initially had with the old, under the aid, when we were dealing with ODA aid, which is sort of orphans and other countries that would receive abundance of aid. So are we seeing the same thing with Chinese funds? I worked on a couple of papers on BRIC financing to Africa and other low-income countries, and we did see that China and other BRICS tended to provide more financing to countries that had natural resources. So I just wanted to get a flavor of the data. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Marla, if you could, there were two gentlemen over here with their hands up. Yes.
Hi, my name is Winslow Robertson, and I'm just a China-Africa blogger. And I have two brief questions. One is, if you guys have heard, recently I read in China Daily that a lot of Chinese NGOs are springing up, and they emphasize that the connection between the Chinese government and these Chinese NGOs, they have a lot of support. And I was wondering if these NGO projects start to come up and come to fruition and do really effective programs, what would they count as, if anything? And then the other thing is question/comment about when researching a lot of China-Africa stuff, a lot of the Chinese getting flattened into everything China does or a Chinese person does represents all of China. And so when I hear things about road construction or schools being built or dams being built, while yes, that's China, I wonder if we can have a more precise language to count this as development assistance versus whatever other words we want to use. But one of the things that I find particularly taxing in my research is all China's the same, all Chinese projects do this, oh, China's aiding our development because they built a road, but maybe China Axum built a road or Sinopac built something else, and it's not quite aid or development. That's it, thank you.
Thank you. And one more question, please.
Yeah, my name's David Phillips. I write things and I run a small firm here. In 2011, actually, the Chinese government produced a white paper on development aid, and it was quite a lot of information in it. It broke down Chinese aid into 3 categories, such as concessional loans and 2 other categories. I personally found it quite useful, and I was wondering if you had any comments on that paper in terms of how useful it was to you. And secondly, I was wondering if the Chinese government had plans, in fact, to follow that up, and in fact to sort of open out a bit on that example. Thank you.
Panel, who wants to take what here? We've got a question about the white paper, a couple questions about the Angola example, seeking further clarification. Question which I think sort of was reinforcing what I understand to be your point, that the importance of definitions and clarity. Who wants to go first? Bradley.
I'll take a shot. So first of all, I guess going backwards, the white paper, I think we're all in agreement that was a major step in the right direction. It's a sign of greater openness to the development community about what China's doing, where they're doing it. So big fans of the white paper, looking forward to seeing follow-on pieces that help improve our understanding of China's activities overseas. They still have not taken that step of disclosing country-level data or project-level data, and that's sort of the void that we're filling for the time being. On the issue of being more precise about language, I loved your comment because we want to have this debate. We want to have an open discussion and debate about how to categorize all the different types of flows, some of which have a developmental purpose. coming from China to Africa, but also to other regions. China's very active in other parts of the world. So we've put something on the table. We've put a categorization scheme in our paper. We really invite input and feedback on that. We are not 100% convinced that we got it exactly right, but we think we're moving in the right direction and welcome that discussion. I guess on this issue, I guess, John, you mentioned the issue about XM and OPIC. So XM and OPIC are included in our measures of US OOF. So when I put those graphs side by side, it includes their activities. However, we're measuring commitments, which does not account for repayments on those loans. So this is sort of a technical issue. We could take it offline, but the bottom line is, yes, we are capturing XM and OPIC. You know, you do raise an interesting question, though. I understood the thrust of your question as being, you know, are we still sort of comparing apples and oranges? And to some extent, we are. And that was why I put those two graphs side by side that showed, you know, the total volume of official finance from China and the US is quite similar, but the composition is vastly different. And so your point is well taken there. And then I guess this other issue about these bundled deals that have a concessional component and a non-concessional component, I can follow up with you to give you more direction on exactly how we approach this, but my understanding of the way that this was done was that wherever possible, if we were able to parse out the concessional component, we actually treated it as a separate record or separate activity, and then made the non-concessional piece its own project. And to some extent, there may be that may be sort of artificial, but it made it easier for us to classify things into ODA, OOF, or this vague official finance category. There were times where we could not unbundle these different activities, and that's precisely why we have this vague official finance category, because, you know, a lot of folks, I think, are want to run away from imprecision or uncertainty. We want to lay bare the uncertainty and the imprecision, because we think we can't get more precise data until we know where the imprecision exists. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken.
I think you sort of covered it, Brad, but I see, Andres, did you each have something to add?
Yes,
Please,
so
go ahead.
I think there was also the question, what is in? So did we cover state-owned enterprises? Did we cover the Exim Bank? Did we cover humanitarian assistance? And did we cover NGO aid? So I think we have to distinguish what is covered by the database and the website and what we analyze in the working paper. So in the whole process of gathering a database on China's official development finance, we also detected a lot of projects provided by state-owned enterprises and NGOs. So you will find all these projects with all 57 variables on our webpage. But we just believe that these data are less comprehensive than our data on official flows provided by government agencies. So the focus, the aim of the project was to collect data on official development finance. And this includes the Exim Bank. This is a government agency, so in the values we provide here, 101 billion US dollars over the 2000-2011 period. This includes all government agencies, including the Exim Bank. And of course, it also includes humanitarian assistance, as also the OECD defines defines that humanitarian assistance is part of ODA. So we try to follow as closely as possible the OECD definitions to allow comparisons between China and OECD donors.
Andreas, thank you. Vij, did you have something? Vij, and then Yinwang, I'll come to you in a moment.
Just a couple of brief points about the points raised by the staffer from the IMF. I think the question about project choice is a really important one. And we don't know a lot about how these projects are being chosen. And they do seem to be of very varied value if assessed particularly from the point of view of macroeconomic stability or of development. I mean, some projects, it's very clear there's a development impact. Other things, one could argue, are being done for political reasons. Some of the choices of countries is also questionable. There's also issues around what is the sort of appropriateness of engagement from a political perspective versus a development perspective. I think a number of these things are sort of coming into play as we look at these choices of projects and choices of countries. I think a couple of things you raised, this question of Dutch disease, aid-related Dutch disease, is significant for very small countries. If you start to pour stuff in for political reasons, you may also be creating, all sorts of problems on the macro front, including flooding the country with money and appreciating the exchange rate and whatnot. I think the other issue that we need to start thinking about is further down the road, are we going to create a debt crisis? A lot of this is debt financing, and it's being given for reasons not quite related to macroeconomic stability. What does that mean for countries, some of these countries down the road? And I think that's the reason this kind of data is very valuable, because it gives you some numbers, and then you can start to think about, what these kinds of negative impacts might be down the road, as well as the positive impacts, which we've talked about, the development impacts of good roads and education and health and so on. There's lots of positive impacts as well, but there's also some things I think that we need to worry about.
Vij, you've given me an idea when you talk about the, things done for political ends, and they may have some important state building things, but there seem to be an awful lot of stadiums on the list, and it might be fun for somebody to just use Google Earth and compile a whole series of screenshots of these stadiums, which are presumably, I don't know how good Google Earth is in Africa, or go on the ground and get. You could do a nice album, Chinese funded athletic venues in Africa. I said Yanwang would be next, I think.
Some comments on the definitions and the bundled deals. I think the definitions of ODA is a little bit too narrow. It may not, if we use the ODA so strictly, then it may not reflect the full extent of emerging donors' assistance to low-income countries. For example, when I worked with the Chinese partner, they are so confused about this requirement of 25% of grant element and how to calculate that. Maybe IMF's TA assistant would be needed. Secondly, regarding the OOF, and there is a strong trend that many countries will increase their OOF because China has set an example, and the Korean Exim Bank will follow up. Regarding bundled deals, the question may be related to resource for infrastructure deals. I think there are some advantage and disadvantage of that deals, and China faces a lot of criticism on that kind of deals. I think it has the advantage because it links natural resources with infrastructure. It transforms the natural resources directly into infrastructure without going through the taxation, the rent collection and the allocation and the planning and the implementation stage. Because African countries, they need capacity. They are weak in capacity, in planning, in collecting the rents, in planning the infrastructure. So it has some advantages, but of course, transparency needs to be improved. Thanks.
Thanks very much. We're just about wrapping up. Fortunately, there is a reception, and I understand that our presenters are going to stay around and can take your questions and comments. Andreas, you had something to say, and then Vij, if you like, but I want to then give Bradley, I think, the last word. And you can also waive your opportunity to speak if you wish, but I know that Andreas wanted to say something. final minute for anybody who wants it.
So just a brief comment, so we all want to go to the reception. So I think I want to follow up on your comment on the stadiums, so how you could see the stadiums on Google Maps. So one of the big next steps of the whole project will be to geocode all Chinese activities in Africa. So you will be able to, you will have really nice, great maps on our website, and you will be able to identify where most of the projects are located. So one of our next ideas to improve.
Thank you. Vidj? Brad, final remarks from you.
Well, I guess I'd just end with an invitation for you all to sort of participate in this process. So typically when you come to an event like this, group presents their paper and you know, the gospel is spoken and you accept the gospel and then you go on your merry way. But we have really approached this, I think, with a spirit of humility that we don't have it all figured out here, and we really think there's a lot of collective knowledge in the development community about what China's doing and to what effect. And so we just want to re-emphasize that we would like nothing more than for you all to read the methodology, read the paper, kick the tires, spend some time looking at china.aiddata.org, and our commitment to you is that we will be responsive as these comments come in and inputs received, and we'll try to deliver a better product over time.
And in that spirit, CGD has a small experiment with a Weibo account, so we'll be putting this out on Weibo. You might be getting, you say there's a lot of experience in this community. Of course, there's a lot of experience in China. Who knows? You may get some corrections from citizens in China as well. Please join me in thanking the panel for this terrific event.